Ezra lived in the stark shadows of his own making, his isolated ranch a sanctuary of perpetual dust and profound silence, an earthen fortress against the relentless phantoms of a past he desperately sought to outrun. Each dawn was a monotonous reenactment, the familiar groan of protesting timber as he rose, the potent, bitter aroma of fresh-brewed coffee clinging to the air, a silent witness to his self-imposed penance. The vast, parched earth, cracked and unforgiving beneath the ceaseless sun, mirrored the landscape of his soul, while the implacable wind whispered its lonesome ancient melody across the arid fields, a mournful lament he knew intimately in the very sinews of his weary flesh. The rhythmic creak of the windmill, the only consistent sound, was suddenly shattered one searing afternoon by an uncertain, hesitant rap upon the rusted iron of his front door, a sound that immediately frayed the tenuous threads of his forced tranquility and pulled him unwillingly from the depths of his accustomed solitude. It was the softest invasion, yet it struck him with the force of a thunderclap. Beyond the threshold stood a child, impossibly small, her wide eyes, a terrified, unfathomable blue, fixed on his calloused, weather-beaten face, and the whispered confession, "My parents died," felt less like words and more like a physical blow, tightening a suffocating knot of old guilt in Ezra's throat. He, a man who had assiduously fled from any and all attachments, felt the utterly foreign words, "You are my family now," escape his lips, a new, unforeseen and heavy burden settling upon his stooped shoulders, binding him to an innocence he felt utterly undeserving of protecting. The moral dilemma, stark and unforgiving, burned under the merciless sun. Would he shield this fragile life or inevitably drag her into the encroaching darkness that defined his own existence? His thick fingers instinctively grazed the worn, old wood of the doorframe, the insidious tendrils of fear and an ancient, unvanquished trauma beginning to corrode his already fragile resolve, shattering the illusion of peace he had so carefully constructed. The forced quietude of the desert, however, was destined for an even more brutal interruption. Days later, an unexpected shadow fell across the sun-drenched yard, the arrival of a stranger with the unmistakable air of a seasoned hunter, stirring the stagnant mud of forgotten misdeeds. When the man's voice, rough as dry earth, inquired about her little girl, Ezra felt the cold, sharp truth of a blade press against his throat, a faint, acrid scent of gunpowder suddenly hanging heavy in the hot, still air. The desert's sepulchral silence now guarded a new, perilous secret, a somber pact silently forged between him, the bewildered orphan, and the thirsty, unyielding land itself, concerning what truly lay beneath the shifting layer of red earth, forever sealing their entwined destinies in a terrifying, unspoken truth. Ezra's heart, a frantic drum in his chest, hammered against his ribs, each brutal beat a painful echo in the sudden, suffocating vacuum of silence that followed the stranger's terse query. He could feel the small, trembling hand of the girl, now fully concealed behind his leg, clenched tighter on his worn denim pant leg, her palpable fear a cold, leaden weight pressing heavily against his already burdened conscience. The stranger, a gaunt, unyielding figure draped in travel-stained canvas and scarred leather, his eyes, sharp, flint-hard and unblinking beneath the dust-caked brim of his hat, simply waited, a predator patiently observing its cornered prey. The merciless midday sun beat down, raising shimmering heat waves from the parched, cracked earth, and Ezra could taste the metallic tang of his own terror mingling with the omnipresent grit and dust in his mouth. He struggled, his tongue thick and clumsy like a piece of dry leather, to formulate any coherent response, acutely aware that a single, misspoken word could irrevocably unravel the precarious, fragile sanctuary he had painstakingly constructed, not merely for his own tormented soul, but now, crucially, for this innocent, unexpected life. A bead of sweat, inexplicably cold despite the infernal heat, trickled its way down his temple, carrying with it the unbearable, corrosive pressure of a past he had desperately, futilely attempted to bury, now undeniably rising to confront him in the stark, unforgiving glare of the desert day. He registered the stranger's calloused, steady hand, resting with an unnerving stillness near the dark, oil-stained butt of a formidable revolver, an unspoken, chilling threat shimmering almost visibly in the hot, stagnant air. Ezra, his throat constricted and dry as the desert wind, finally managed to croak out a question, something deliberately vague about what pressing business might have brought a man to this forgotten, God-forsaken corner of nowhere, attempting to deflect, to buy himself. Just a precious moment's reprieve from the escalating tension, but the stranger merely offered a tight, humorless smile that never quite reached the icy depths of his eyes. "Just looking for something I lost," the man drawled, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that scraped like loose stones in a dry riverbed. The unspoken implication sharp and clear as a newly honed blade, his gaze methodically sweeping over the desolate ranch house, lingering for a fraction too long on the single, small, boarded-up window. The girl, a tiny, fragile bundle of anxieties, whimpered almost inaudibly, pressing her small frame even closer to Ezra's leg, her insignificant weight a searing, constant reminder of his new, utterly unwanted and profoundly dangerous responsibility. The very air itself crackled with an unspoken challenge, the subtle, earthy scent of sun-baked sagebrush and distant horseflesh now subtly mingling with the phantom scent of gunpowder that Ezra vividly imagined. He knew with a chilling certainty that pierced him to the deepest marrow of his bones that this man wasn't merely looking, he was a relentless hunter, and Ezra's isolated ranch, once a sanctuary of solitude, had, in an instant, been irrevocably transformed into a cunningly laid trap, the unforgiving, dry red earth now becoming the unwitting stage for a harrowing confrontation he had successfully, desperately avoided for untold years. The fear, a cold, twisting serpent, coiled tight in the pit of his gut, urged him with visceral desperation to turn and flee, but the child's small, trembling, yet utterly tenacious grip on his leg was a potent, unyielding tether, binding him immovably to this perilous ground, forcing him to stand firm and face the encroaching, terrifying shadow. The stranger's gaze, unblinking and devoid of any discernible warmth, bore into Ezra, a silent appraisal that stripped away layers of manufactured calm, exposing the raw, trembling fear beneath. His eyes, the color of river stones, held a strange, unsettling clarity that suggested a man accustomed to seeing beyond superficial pleasantries, a hunter who could read the faint disturbance in the dust and intuit the prey's hiding place. The air itself grew taut, stretched thin by the unspoken challenge, punctuated only by the mournful, cyclical creak of the old windmill turning lazily in the distance, a sound that usually brought a measure of peace, but now felt like the ticking of a doomsday clock. The child, a fragile, shivering weight against his leg, clung tighter still, her small knotty fingers digging into the coarse denim, a tiny, desperate anchor in a swirling sea of dread. Ezra could feel the prickle of sweat forming on his brow, the rough texture of his old bandana suddenly chafing his neck, as the phantom scent of gunpowder and dried blood, an echo from forgotten skirmishes, seemed to coalesce around them, a chilling premonition of the violence that might erupt from this static tableau, shattering the fragile, forced tranquility of his isolated existence. He swallowed, the movement a rasp against his parched throat, the taste of metallic fear strong on his tongue. "Looking for a girl," the stranger finally stated, his voice a low, gravelly timbre that resonated with an unsettling finality. Not a question, but a declaration, his eyes flicking pointedly towards the small, huddled form partially concealed behind Ezra's leg. "Name's Alara. About her age, dark hair, blue dress, a small scar just above her right eyebrow." Each detail, delivered with cold precision, felt like a nail driven into Ezra's carefully constructed coffin of lies, an indisputable proof that this man knew, shattering any illusion of deniability. Ezra's mind, usually slow and deliberate, now spun in a frantic, desperate maelstrom, searching for an escape route, a believable lie, anything to divert the encroaching truth that threatened to engulf them both. The sun, a relentless, punishing orb in the vast, unforgiving sky, beat down on the corrugated iron roof of the porch, its heat pressing in, mirroring the suffocating pressure of the moment. He could smell the dry, sun-baked earth, the faint, sweet decay of distant mesquite, and the unsettling, metallic tang of the stranger's presence, an instinctual alarm ringing loudly in his bones, signaling immediate, profound danger. He tightened his jaw, the muscles rigid, preparing for the inevitable, for the terrifying moment when the fragile truce would shatter and the buried secrets would finally claw their way to the surface. Ezra's breath hitched, a rough, involuntary sound lost in the vast quiet, as the stranger's voice, devoid of inflection yet sharp as a honed blade, sliced through the thin veil of his denial. Each descriptive detail: Ilara, dark hair, blue dress, a small scar just above her right eyebrow, landed like a physical blow, igniting a panicked inferno in the dry kindling of his mind, confirming beyond any doubt that this man did not just know of a girl, but knew Ilara, stripping away every possible defense. A cold, leaden weight settled in his stomach, a familiar sensation from a past he had desperately tried to bury, now rising with the stench of disturbed earth. His hand, calloused from years of solitary labor, instinctively tightened into a fist at his side, the knuckles white, a silent testament to the churning storm of dread and nascent fury that threatened to break through his stoic facade. Relentless sun, a merciless witness, cast their long, distorted shadows across the dusty ground, lengthening the moment, making the air feel impossibly thick and heavy, charged with an invisible, suffocating pressure, each second stretching into an eternity of unspoken threats and crumbling resolve. He could feel Ilara's small form pressed against his leg, a warm, innocent anchor against the encroaching cold, and it solidified his desperate, burgeoning conviction. He would not yield. The stranger, a figure of patient menace, offered no immediate follow-up to his chilling pronouncements, instead allowing the damning weight of his words to settle, to fester in the suffocating silence that hung between them, thick as a shroud. His eyes, keen and unblinking beneath the brim of his dusty hat, never left Ezra's face, tracing every subtle flicker of emotion, every tightened muscle, every telltale sign of the inner turmoil that ripped through the rancher. Ezra felt a primal instinct scream in his veins, a desperate urge to lash out, to protect, but a deeper, colder logic kept him rooted, a fragile dam holding back a torrent of impulsive rage. The faint, sweet decay of distant mesquite in the air was suddenly overlaid with a sharper, more metallic tang, almost like blood or old iron, an olfactory hallucination born of sheer stress. He could hear the almost imperceptible buzz of flies circling in the heat, an insignificant sound that somehow amplified the profound quiet, making the tension vibrate through his very bones, a low, incessant hum of imminent danger. Every fiber of his being was screaming for escape, for a way to untangle this deadly knot, but the stranger's unwavering stare, devoid of mercy, made it clear that evasion was no longer an option. Only direct, brutal confrontation remained. Ezra's throat felt as if it were packed with sand, dry and rasping with an unspoken denial that died on his tongue, suffocated by the chilling precision of the stranger's words. The sheer audacity, the methodical accuracy with which the man described Ilara, down to the almost imperceptible curve of her lower lip when she was lost in thought, stripped away any remaining pretense of ignorance or plausible deniability, leaving Ezra exposed and trembling on the precipice of a terrible choice. A sickening wave of nausea washed over him, a physical manifestation of the dread that curdled in his gut, reminding him of the cold, metallic taste of fear he'd known years ago, a taste he had sworn to himself would never return, especially not here in this sanctuary he had painstakingly built from the dust and bones of his shattered past. His gaze darted, almost imperceptibly, towards the dim interior of the cabin, an instinctual, animalistic urge to shield the fragile life within from the predatory glint in the stranger's eyes, even as the weight of his own unspoken truths pressed down, threatening to crush him under its immutable burden. The distant, mournful cry of a hawk circling high above the baked earth seemed to echo the silent scream trapped in his own chest, a desolate sound in a world suddenly devoid of any false peace. The stranger, sensing Ezra's paralyzed silence, allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smirk to pull at the corner of his mouth, a gesture of quiet triumph that sent a shiver down Ezra's spine, colder than any desert night. He shifted his weight, the leather of his gun belt creaking softly, a sound that resonated like a death knell in the oppressive quiet, and his eyes, which had been fixed on Ezra's, now flickered briefly towards the cabin door, a pointed, terrifying implication of his next move. "She's a strong-willed one, that girl," the stranger murmured, his voice a low, gravelly current against the relentless buzz of insects, betraying an intimacy with Ilara's character that sent a fresh jolt of fear through Ezra, suggesting a deeper, more sinister connection than he had initially understood. The heavy scent of dust and parched earth outside, usually a comforting embrace, now felt like a suffocating blanket, pressing in from all sides, and Ezra knew, with a dreadful certainty, that every breath he drew was borrowed, every second a reprieve before the inevitable unraveling of his carefully constructed solitude, a debt that would soon be collected with interest. Ezra felt the ground beneath his worn boots waver, a sudden dizzying sensation as if the very foundations of his desolate ranch, the sanctuary he had painstakingly built from years of self-imposed exile, were crumbling into the pervasive dust. The stranger's casual mention of Ilara's will, delivered with such an unnerving familiarity, painted a vivid, horrifying picture of an intrusion far deeper than Ezra could have imagined, suggesting not just observation, but perhaps a prolonged, unsettling surveillance that curdled his blood. A bitter, metallic taste coated his tongue, the flavor of fear mingling with the old guilt that always lingered, and his gaze instinctively darted to the rough-hewn planks of the cabin door, imagining the fragile, unsuspecting girl within, her small presence now a beacon for unseen dangers. The sun, usually a harsh but familiar companion, now felt like an accusation, its relentless heat pressing down, intensifying the suffocating realization that his past, a beast he thought he had chained and buried, had not only broken free, but had now seized the one innocent life he had, however reluctantly, vowed to protect. The stranger's lips stretched into a thin, predatory smile, a chilling affirmation of Ezra's worst anxieties, and he slowly reached into his coat, not for a weapon, but to retrieve a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its surface smooth and worn by countless touches, a child's forgotten treasure. "She misses this," the man stated, his voice devoid of any genuine warmth, merely a cold pronouncement, as he held the trinket aloft for a moment before letting it vanish back into his inner pocket, a deliberate, cruel display of possession and leverage. Ezra's breath hitched, a sharp, ragged sound caught in his throat, recognizing the toy immediately from Ilara's few cherished belongings, and the sight of it in the stranger's hand twisted a knot of dread in his stomach, a visceral blow that resonated with the icy certainty that this man had not merely observed, but had been inside Ezra's home, violating the last bastion of his desperate peace. The faint, high whine of a distant vulture circling in the impossibly blue sky above seemed to mock his helplessness, a silent, grim spectator to the unraveling of his fragile world, a world now teetering on the edge of a precipice, pulled by the weight of an unpayable debt. The small wooden bird, now tucked away from view but its image seared into Ezra's mind, felt like a burning coal in his own chest, a phantom weight pressing against his sternum, a cold, clammy dread, far more potent than any desert chill, permeated his very bones, manifesting as a tremor in his calloused hands that had once wielded a pickaxe with ruthless efficiency, but now felt uselessly heavy and inert. The implication wasn't just that the stranger had been inside his remote sanctuary, a violation in itself, shattering the illusion of safety Ezra had so painstakingly constructed, but that he had lingered, observed, perhaps even watched. Ilara, a grotesque intimacy that made Ezra's skin crawl with revulsion and a nascent protective fury he hadn't known he still possessed. His breath, which had been caught in a ragged gasp, now struggled to find a steady rhythm, each inhale tasting of the dust and the bitter tang of his own past mistakes, a past he had meticulously buried beneath layers of solitude and denial, only for it to erupt now, a virulent, inescapable plague aimed directly at the most vulnerable thing in his life. The very air around them seemed to thicken, heavy with unspoken threats, the distant, mournful cry of a hawk overhead, an elegy for the fleeting peace Ezra had dared to cultivate. The stranger's lips curved into a slow, deliberate smile, a predatory gesture that didn't quite reach his eyes, which remained cold and assessing, like those of a man examining a trapped animal on the verge of snapping. "She's a sweet thing," he drawled, the words delivered with a disturbing casualness that grated on Ezra's already frayed nerves, and remarkably perceptive for her age. "Asks a great many questions about missing family." The unspoken implication hung in the sun-baked air like a shimmering mirage, an invisible lasso tightening around Ezra's throat, each word a deliberate twist of the rope, threatening to sever the tenuous connection he had formed with Ilara. Ezra swallowed hard, his throat dry and constricted, the dust in his mouth suddenly feeling like grit, the bitter taste of fear mingling with a nascent, desperate anger that threatened to boil over. He could feel the familiar, comforting weight of his own Colt beneath his faded jacket, a weapon he'd always relied upon. But the thought of drawing it, of spilling blood again and drawing Ilara further into the violent eddy of his past, made his stomach churn with a profound, debilitating nausea. This wasn't merely a threat, it was a promise, whispered by a ghost of his own making, a relentless, inescapable consequence finally come to collect. The stranger's gaze, sharp and unblinking, bored, into Ezra, an invisible probe peeling back layers of weathered skin and hardened resolve to expose the raw, bleeding wound of his conscience. Ezra's breath hitched, a ragged sound lost in the vast silence of the desert afternoon, the heavy air thick with the scent of dry earth and the acrid tang of distant sage. He tasted ash and copper on his tongue, a phantom echo of forgotten violence, and his large hands, calloused and gnarled from years of solitary labor, trembled imperceptibly at his sides, itching for the familiar cold comfort of the pistol grip. Every fiber of his being screamed to protect Ilara, to rip this wolf from his doorstep, but the paralyzing dread of unleashing the beast within, the very reason he'd sought this desolate refuge, held him captive, a prisoner of his own making. The sun beat down mercilessly, a golden hammer striking the anvil of his fear, and he felt the beads of sweat trickle down his temples, mingling with the dust that clung to his grizzled beard, each drop a tiny, salty testament to his profound, agonizing indecision. The memory of the shallow grave, the hurried burial under a sky indifferent to human suffering, flashed behind his eyes, a grim, spectral reminder of the secret that now threatened to consume them all. A slow, predatory smile devoid of warmth stretched across the stranger's lips, a stark contrast to the stark landscape, revealing a flash of teeth that seemed too white against his sun-darkened face. He reached into his coat again, his movements deliberate, unhurried, pulling out not a weapon but a small, tarnished silver locket, the very one Ezra had seen Ilara clutch in her sleep on more than one occasion. "She dropped this in the kitchen just before I left," the man purred, his voice a low, gravelly current, carrying an undertone of mock concern that made Ezra's blood run cold. A rather sentimental keepsake, wouldn't you say? Perhaps a memento of her actual family before they disappeared. The locket dangled from his fingers, catching the harsh sunlight, a cruel, glittering emblem of invasion and intimate betrayal, a direct challenge to the fragile peace Ezra had desperately tried to construct. The implied threat, the insinuation that he had been inside Ezra's home, had observed Ilara, was a physical blow, leaving him gasping for air, the desert air suddenly too thin, too sharp. Ezra's vision blurred at the edges, the world narrowing to the glint of that locket and the cold, unyielding eyes of the man who held it, a man who clearly knew everything. Ezra's heart pounded like a drum against the arid silence, each beat echoing the thunderous realization that his carefully constructed solitude had been not merely breached, but utterly ravaged. The tarnished silver locket, dangling mockingly in the stranger's fingers, became a burning brand in his vision, a tangible proof of violation, a cruel mockery of the sanctuary he'd tried to build. A wave of primal, guttural fear washed over him, not just for himself but for Ilara, the innocent child now ensnared in the malevolent currents of his resurrected past. The familiar whisper of the desert wind, once a comforting lullaby of isolation, transformed into a mocking chorus of his failures, each gust tasting like ash in his parched mouth. He found his gaze unwillingly tethered to the locket, each glint of silver a searing reminder of his broken promise, his abysmal inability to shield her from the encroaching darkness he had inadvertently, perhaps even selfishly, invited. A cold sweat, clammy and suffocating, slicked his brow, the relentless sun suddenly an oppressive weight, the very air thick with unspoken accusation. His calloused hands clenched into useless fists, nails digging painfully into his palms, a futile, desperate gesture against the tightening noose of circumstance that now threatened to choke the very life out of his tenuous existence. Sensing the tremor of Ezra's unraveling resolve, the stranger took a slow, predatory step forward, his looming shadow falling over Ezra like a shroud, a physical manifestation of the encroaching darkness. A faint, almost imperceptible scent, stale tobacco mingled with something metallic, like old dried blood, reached Ezra's nostrils, a chilling premonition of violence. The girl, the hunter stated, his voice now stripped of any feigned politeness, a flat, unyielding declaration, needs to be reunited with her proper kin, a matter that is far beyond your purview, old man. You are merely an inconvenient, albeit easily removable obstacle in that necessary process, unless, of course, you intend to assist in her swift and uneventful return. He flicked the locket dismissively, letting it slide back into his coat pocket with a soft, almost inaudible click. The small, deliberate action an eloquent demonstration of his absolute control, of the chilling ease with which he could discard both Ilara's fragile safety and Ezra's desperately sought precarious peace. The implications of proper kin hung in the scorching air, a thinly veiled, utterly devastating threat against Ilara's very existence, a horrifying echo of the brutal, unforgiving past Ezra had tried so desperately to bury, now unearthed and gleaming with fresh menace under the unforgiving, merciless desert sky. Ezra's throat felt dry, his tongue thick and useless, the monstrous weight of an inevitable decision pressing down upon him, crushing his spirit. The hunter's words, sharp as flint, had carved a new canyon through the already ravaged landscape of Ezra's soul, twisting the knife of his conscience with an icy hand. The locket's brief glint now burned into his vision like a brand. He felt the phantom weight of a long-forgotten colt in his palm, the slick familiarity of its oiled steel, the metallic scent of gunpowder and desperation filling his nostrils, not from the present, but from the brutal theater of 1,000 forgotten shootouts and the chilling quiet that followed, a silence always broken by the rasp of his own ragged breath, his throat constricted, a raw, bitter taste coating his tongue, the very air in his isolated shack seeming to thicken and press in, suffocating him with the weight of monstrous choices made and paid for. And now another, far more terrible, demanding its due, a visceral, primal surge, cold and sharp as a winter wind, raced through his veins, stirring the beast he had tried for so long to cage, Protector emerging from the ashes of a repentant killer, fueled by the stark, terrifying image of Ilara's small, trusting hand in his, a fragile anchor against the encroaching tide of his dark, inescapable past, the desert wind outside whispering a mournful, prophetic warning. Then a shift, a slow, agonizing burn, deep in the core of him, ignited not by fear, but by a scorching, righteous fury that chased away the fog of guilt and self-loathing, hardening his jaw into a granite line. His eyes, which had been clouded with the ghost mists of memory and regret, cleared with an ancient, terrifying resolve, locking onto the hunter with a gaze that held the unwavering promise of violence, a silent declaration that the man before him was no longer speaking to a broken penitent, but to a force that had once leveled mountains of men. A low, guttural growl, more animal than human, rumbled deep in Ezra's chest, a sound that promised pain and retribution, echoing the subtle, almost imperceptible shift of his right hand, dropping imperiously, casually, towards the worn, familiar grip of the rusty iron poker leaning against the cold hearth, its rough, pitted surface a familiar comfort. The hunter, who had been so sure of his dominion, so accustomed to the pliability of lesser men, faltered. A flicker of surprise, then something colder, more calculating, dancing in his eyes as he recognized the dangerous, unmistakable gleam of a cornered beast ready to tear itself apart, or anyone in its path to protect its unlikely newfound cub, sealing their shared fate under the indifferent blazing sun.